Moshi moshi, how are you all doing? Today I have more adventures in Japan to share with you. As you may recall from watching my last videos, I visited there this past April. If you want to see the first part of the series, please click here. Or alternatively, you can watch the quick recap that I will play on screen right now. Last time I talked about the cities of Otaru and Sapporo. Today's video will cover Asahikawa and Abashiri, Abashiri being the northernmost place we visited in Hokkaido. During our 2-night stay in Otaru, we enjoyed the hospitality of a Japanese couple and their pets. On the morning we left, we had onigiri for breakfast. They were really filling. So much so I had to push myself to finish them. While eating, we watched TV and the cats, Yuki and Sakura, kept us company. I strongly advise you to take some time to watch TV while in Japan. I found it quite an interesting experience. You might know this already, but Japanese TV has a number of rather peculiar characteristics. First of all, Japanese programs have a lot of text on screen. Almost everything that is said also appears on screen in the form of text. There are letters flying around, zooming in and out, flashing, sometimes they're just idle. This amount of text makes the screen feel cluttered. The sort of thing that would get you a spanking on a design course. Now, personally, I do fancy a good wall of text, to be perfectly honest, and I am the type of person who watches everything with subtitles, even when they could perfectly go without them. I also read really fast. That aside, Having both written and spoken Japanese on TV at the same time is quite a big help for the ones that are still learning the language. On some other video, if you want, I can teach you how to add Japanese subtitles to the anime that you're watching. You will see it gets easier to understand. Watching anime with English subtitles is not the way. There is a reason why people can watch sub-anime for years and don't get to learn Japanese that way, not even the basics. But yeah, lots of text on TV indirectly helps us, non-natives, but they don't do it for our sake, obviously. They do it for them. And there are reasons why they do that, but I will not dwell into that here. Another big thing about Japanese TV is that many shows incorporate the reactions of the audience or celebrities, which are displayed alongside the main content in a mini video somewhere on the screen. The sort of thing you expect to find on YouTube rather than on TV. Also, lots of food-related content. If you want, I can make a video on the history of TV in Japan, their shows, their marketing strategies, and how they translate to ads, and not just the bizarre ones, advertisement as a whole, all of that. Tell me in the comments if you would like to see something like that. I think it will be fun to explore, for me at least. I took a multimedia course, so of course these type of things are of interest to me. Anyway, we finished our breakfast and the lady of the house escorted us to the car. After loading our many bags and suitcases into the car, we set off for Asahikawa. Since it was on the way, we stopped in Tsukigata. Tsukigata is well known for its production of melons and watermelons, namely the Godzilla and Dynamite varieties. Because of this, the city's mascot is a green melon who is a gardener called Berudekan. We went to Tsukigata because we wanted to visit the Kabato Prison Museum. This wasn't the only prison museum we visited. We also went to the Abashiri one. And you might be thinking to yourself, why are you lot so interested in prisons that you visited not only one but two? First, Golden Kamui. Second, the prisons and the inmates they held are deeply intertwined with the history of Hokkaido. Brace yourselves because story time is going to be long today. As you might know, Japan is well known for its very fast modernization and industrialization post-Meiji era, an extraordinary feat that left the whole world in awe. But while this achievement is certainly nothing short of impressive, there is a hidden side to it, the dark side of the moon that is today's Japan. And that dark side goes by the name forced labor. This will be the focus of today's video. We are going to talk about the several groups of politically marginalized people that helped build the Japanese empire in Hokkaido, but more specifically about convict forced labor. The first group of people I'm touching upon is the Ainu, the indigenous people of Hokkaido. Somewhat briefly, but only because the next video will be almost entirely dedicated to them. During the 4th and 5th centuries, Japan was under the control of the Yamato state. If you don't know a lot about the Yamato, don't worry, because I will tell you all about it in the Japanese history playlist. For now, all you need to know is that they are related to the Japanese imperial family. The ones who resisted the Yamato were collectively called Emishi, the barbarians, and they lived in the north. Around the 8th and 9th centuries, Heian period, the Japanese started expanding north, which led to armed conflicts with the Emishi, who, from the 11th century onwards, were increasingly pushed north, at some point being limited to existing in Hokkaido, Sakhalin, and the Kuril Islands. That was when the court started referring to the Emishi as Ezogashima, Ezo for short. In 1603, Japan was unified under Tokugawa Ieyasu, and Ezo was sort of given to the Matsumae clan. In a sense, the Matsumae were unique in the way they operated, since while the other clans' economy was based on rice agriculture, they had exclusive rights to trade with the Ainu on specific places, designated as basho. The system was called basho seido. The Ainu, both the adults and the children, were considered contractors and had to work for the Japanese on large-scale fisheries. Not always willingly. In some instances, they were coerced into doing this. An example of such coercion can be found on the testimony of the Ainu writer Kayano Shigeru, who explains that in 1858, his grandfather, an Ainu boy from Niputani, current Nibutani, was forced to work under the Basho Seido system, despite the pleas of the village chief, Inize Tet. Inize Tet appealed to the samurai to leave the boy, only 11 years old and small for his age, saying that he would only be in their way if they took him along. The Japanese rejected Inize Tet's supplication, however, stating that even a child was capable of carrying one salmon on his back. The effects the Japanese expansion had on nature also made the lives of the Ainu harder, an example being the devastation caused by the felling forests, with less forests meaning less places for the Ainu to look for food and other natural resources. As for the Ainu women, they were often victims of Japanese sailors. Kimura Kenji, a writer from the Mito domain, reported in 1793 that the husbands of said women would then ask for compensation, which would come in the form of a handful of tobacco. The sayings of the Japanese explorer Matsura Takeshiro from the 1850s corroborate this narrative. He observed that 36 out of the 41 Japanese supervisors in Kuzuri, nowadays Kushiro, forced Ainu women to serve as concubines, after having sent their husbands away to work at Japanese fisheries. A young woman from the Ishikara region contracted syphilis from a fishery supervisor, also after having her husband sent away. When it comes to social position, the Ainu were in a very weird spot. One day barbaric and subhuman, the other one of us, the Japanese, according to what was more convenient politically. The government, bakufu or shogunate, would alternate between treating them as outsiders and forcing them to assimilate to Japanese culture. For example, in response to a perceived Russia threat in the light of the Laxman expedition from 1793 and the Rezanov mission from 1804, which were basically two instances in which the Russians sent men to try and establish trade negotiations, the Bakufu implemented policies to assimilate the Ainu culture of Etorofu, measures which were promptly abandoned after. In this tug-of-war between Russia and Japan, the Ainu were an important card that would be brought to the table when needed and then discarded when not in use. Then, in the 1850s, when the matter of defining a northern border became a priority, the Ainu were used once again. If their Japanese identity was visible enough, Japan would have a stronger case for claiming the lands in which they lived. That's how, in 1875, the Kuril Islands were given to Japan, although they lost Sakhalin to Russia. Enter the Meiji period. Ezo is now called Hokkaido and is under the jurisdiction of the Hokkaido Development Office, Hokkaido Kaitakushi. Forced Ainu labor wasn't discontinued though. It rather took a new form. 2 months before the establishment of the Kaitaku, the Buddhist temple Higashi Onganji offered their help. They wanted to contribute, to build roads in Hokkaido and find people willing to settle on the new lands. Of course, they also wanted to convert these said immigrants, as well as the local Ainu populations, to their Buddhism. The longest road that the temple built connected Date with Satsuporu, current Sapporo. It was 103 kilometers long, and 5,000 people worked on it, including prisoners and Ainu, both groups not being there on their free will. After being forced to work, the Ainu weren't very receptive to the Buddhist teachings of the temple. A surprising turn of events, don't you think? Apparently forcing people to work and then trying to preach to them isn't really the way to go. After Sakhalin became part of Russian territory, many of the Ainu living there were relocated. first to Cape Soya, later to the Ishikari River plain. Kuroda Kiyotaka, head of the Kaitakushi, wanted to put them to work at the Orunai coal mines, but a judge called Matsumoto Juro raised concerns from finding this treatment too similar to the ones on penal colonies received. However, Matsumoto couldn't totally save the Ainu. They were still forced to practice agriculture. This abrupt change in lifestyle led many to die of cholera. I will talk more about the Ainu in the next video. Now let's move to the next group of explored people, the convicts. In the old days, and during many centuries, Ezo was a land for the exiled. Already during the Kamakura period, thieves and pirates were being sent there. Christians too, after the promulgation of the anti-Christian edict in 1614. Priests would travel in disguise to Ezo to preach to the exiled Christian communities. Ninsoku Yoseba, forced labor camps, already existed during the Tokugawa era. They emerged in response to a rising number of homelessness in the 1770s and the 1780s. During that period, natural disasters and crop failures cut Japan's agricultural production by 2/3. Starving peasants started a number of violent uprisings, and in response, the first Ninsoku Yoseba was born, on Ishikawa-jima, an island in the Sumide River, Edo. In 1860, the government ordered the construction of an Ninsoku Yoseba network comprising all areas under the control of the shogunate and in each end. So Yoseba were built in Osaka, Kyoto, Akita, and Akodate. The one in Akodate was established in Uzubetsu, and had a branch in Okushiri Island, but both were already closed by 1870, since the Battle of Akodate disrupted the shipment of rice supplies. It is important to notice that imprisonment wasn't the norm back then. It wasn't a punishment by itself. Instead of prisons, there were arrest houses, called Rōya, where criminals would be held until Judgment Day. It was also here that executions and actual punishments took place, such as decapitation, flogging, and tattooing. The first Rōya was founded under Toyotomi Hideyoshi around 1593. Located in Edo, it was possibly the largest, with capacity to hold 700 inmates at a time. The criminals were separated according to their gender and social status, with vassals, priests, and doctors having better accommodations than the commoners. Their rooms were well lit, had a place where they could wash themselves, a latrine, and tatami flooring. Before the Rōya, petty crimes were punished with the severing of the nose and ears of the offender, but this practice was replaced with short periods of arrest at some point during the late Tokugawa period. In the Rōya, criminals spent their time playing Go, shogi, and games of luck. They would also smoke, even though it was technically forbidden, and talk among themselves, which was allowed during daytime only. Rōya weren't all the same thought, so you have testimonies that sound like horror stories, and some that paint a pretty positive picture of these arrest houses. Let's see an example of each. The Spanish missionary Fray de San Francisco spent 18 months in a Rōya in Edo in 1615. After being interrogated, he was sent to a square wooden building with a cage inside where the prisoners were kept. The cage, 10 meters by 4.18 meters, had huge wooden bars that barely let in any daylight. There were no windows, only an opening for food and water. This prison would hold 100 to 153 prisoners at a time. They were naked except for a cloth that covered their privates, and as so little space, they couldn't stretch their legs without touching one another. In such an environment, it's no surprise that worms and lice proliferated like wildfire, and that fights would break out among the stressed inmates. Ill prisoners would relieve themselves where they stood, so the jail stank of urine and feces. And because they weren't given enough food or enough water, just 2 small cups a day, illness was rampant. 30 to 40 prisoners could be sick at a given time. This testimony contrasts greatly with the experience of the Russian captain Vasily M. Golownin. Golownin entered Kunashir with 6 companions while Japan was in seclusion. This is, only Dutch and Chinese ships could enter the country, and only through Dejima, in Nagasaki. For this crime, Golownin and his companions faced prison for 2 years in Ezo. Initially, they were sent to a prison in Hakodate, and Golownin described the jails there as apartments formed of strong, thick spars of wood, which, but for the difference of size, looked exactly like bird cages, and he had the sight fill them with horror. The captain was locked up alone, something that caused him great despair. The group was then sent to a prison in Matsumae, which Golownin describes as such. One cage was 6 spaces square and 10 feet high. The other was of an equal breadth and 8, but was 8 paces long. We 3 officers were put into the former. The sailors and Alexei was confined in the latter. The entrance of the cage was so low that we were obliged to creep into it. The door was formed of massy spars and was fastened by a strong iron bolt. Above the door was a small hole, through which food was handed to us. A small water closet was constructed at the further end of each cage. The sides of the cage next each other were bounded in such a manner that we could see the sailors, but they could not perceive us. A screen was also placed between the closets, for the purpose of obstructing the view from the one to the other. A guard room was placed against the spars which formed the entrance side of the prison, and which was occupied by 2 soldiers in the service of the imperial government, who were constantly on guard. They could see us and seldom turned their eyes away from us. Prisoners received meals 3 times a day, consisting of rice, pickled radishes, boiled or fried fish, and soups with different herbs and macaroni. Occasionally, the Russian captives were treated to traditional food from their homeland, such as a traditional soup made of white fish and mussel broth. During the winter, prisoners would be served bear and horse meat, and clothed appropriately. Authorities would also make changes to the architecture of the buildings so that the inmates were better protected from the inclement weather. Shortly after arriving, the Russian captives had their measures taken and were able to choose between Russian-styled and Japanese-styled clothes. They were in an okizu, a prison of a superior kind. While there, Golownin and his companions were asked to draw maps and work as translators. Eventually, the Russians attempted an escape, but they were quickly caught and put into another prison in Matsumae, this time a regular Rōya. Before their escape attempt, they were treated as foreign guests, despite the captivity, but afterwards things changed. Now they were treated the same way as Japanese criminals. Still, Golownin's memoir states that we indeed, through this treatment, extremely severe, yet it must nevertheless be acknowledged that the Japanese laws respecting criminals are far more humane than those of most, I might perhaps say of all, European nations. And that the prison was very hygienic, with the prisoners' cages being cleaned and their coverlets and nightclothes aired in the sunlight daily. The meals were served 3 times a day. Boiled rice, soup with seaweed, sweet cabbage and other vegetables, pieces of salt fish occasionally, and water was freely given on request, even during nighttime. So, as you can see, the Japanese prison conditions were not a monolith. It wasn't the same everywhere. Nevertheless, Western countries thought of the whole system as barbaric, and pointed to it as one of the reasons why Japan should be imposed unequal treaties. This is why legal reform was a political priority to the Meiji government. The legal system of a nation is an indicative of its level of civilization, and Japan wanted to be seen as civilized. In 1868, exile was limited to the Exo Island, and imprisonment became more important as a sentence. In 1870, Ohara Shigea, a Meiji official, was sent on a study trip to the British colonies of Singapore and Hong Kong to learn about Western prisons. As a result, Japan's 5 traditional categories of punishment, flogging, severe flogging, hard labor for 1 to 3 years, exile and death, were replaced by imprisonment with hard labor and the death penalty. Except now some of the most extreme execution methods, such as death at the stake and crucifixion, were abolished or heavily restricted. The one that helped Japanese draft a new legal code was French legal expert Gustave-Émile Bossonade de Fontarabie, so it comes as no surprise that it ended up resembling the French legal code a lot. Punishment according to social status was abolished, and death sentence was restricted to death by hanging, and all punishments, apart from fines, all came to contain some form of detention. Bossonade also advocated the abolition of torture. The new legal code came into effect in 1880. Things were supposed to change for the better, but that's not what happened long term, as you will see. As you know, the Meiji period was when Ezo, or Hokkaido, started to really be colonized, and the Kaitakushi, responsible for the development of the region, was formed. But the government needed settlers, people to go live in Hokkaido. So what did they do to make people want to go there? They tried to entice them by offering financial aid for a period of 3 years. But the clearing of the land and growing crops was so hard, the climate was so cold, and the isolation so intolerable, that most returned to Honshu after the 3 years were finished. The Kaitakushi tried then to enlist former samurai, those whose superiors were against the new government. These men were now impoverished and in great need of a way to make a living, so the government gave them 8 acres of land in Hokkaido and a house with a Russian-style stove. These men were called Tondenhei, farmer soldiers. They were allowed to keep their swords and given guns, so that they could protect the northern frontier in case the Russians invaded. From 1869 to 1871, 18 immigrant groups attempted to settle on the new land, 11 of whom were former samurai. It is estimated that around 12,000 people immigrated to Hokkaido in the following 12 years. In 1882, the Kaitakushi's administrative responsibilities were transferred to 3 newly established prefectures, Nemuro, Hakodate, and Sapporo. The first years of the Meiji era were turbulent. Following the Battle of Hakodate, of which I talked about in the video that will appear on the corner, there were several samurai uprisings, revolts of those unsatisfied with the new government. The biggest of which was the Setsume Rebellion, or Seinen War. It happened 9 years into the Meiji era and lasted for about 8 months. The leader, Saigo Takamori, was mortally wounded, and 43,000 individuals were arrested, with 2,764 being executed and 27,000 sentenced to detention and forced labor. The existing prison system was not ready for such a rising number of political offenders, so a new type of prison was created, the Shūjikan, gated and control prison. The first in the prefecture of Miyagi resembled the penitentiary in Leuven, Belgium, but made out of wood instead of stone. In 1878, another Shūjikan was built in the Tokyo district of Kosuge. Despite the government's efforts, Hokkaido's colonization wasn't going fast at all. This is why on 17 of September 1879, Interior Minister Ito Hirobumi sent a letter stating the following. Therefore, I think that the prisoners should be transported to Hokkaido. The climate and soil of Hokkaido are different from other regions, but there are hundreds of ri of fertile land that the prisoners could reclaim, or they could work in mining. On days when it is extremely cold, and the Earth Heart, they can be tasked with suitable activities. When the deportees, or those sentenced to forced labor, are discharged, they will be made to work in agriculture or to work in a craft, and their numbers will slowly increase over the years. This idea of ease was approved. After all, it was the perfect solution. Now they had a place where they could send the increasing number of political offenders, manpower to clear the lands, and there was even the possibility that the reformed convicts would become settlers and start families once their terms ended. 3 Shūjikan were built in Hokkaido, in Kabato, Sorachi, and Kushiro. Political convicts were mainly sent to Kabato, felons to Sorachi, and those who used to be in the military and police were kept in Kushiro. Besides samurai, there was another big group that was targeted around this time, members of the Freedom and People's Rights Movement, which promoted liberty, equality, and the right to an elected government. The group had members from all social classes, from the rich to the poor, but as it grew, it started to radicalize and turn violent. The first 5 years of the history of prisons in Hokkaido are not as well documented as the post-1886 era, since they were not as tragic. In fact, the prisoners were a vital part of the community, so the relationship between them and the common folk was much better than that of the later years. And this is how we arrive at the prison whose museum I and my family visited, the Kabato Prison. This was the first prison that was built in Hokkaido, in 1881, region of Shibetsuputu. When the prison opened, this Ainu name was replaced by Tsukigata, homage to Tsukigata Kyoshi, the first director of the Kabato Prison. But this man wasn't just a director. He also commanded the police, the postal service. He was basically the local boss, and the population addressed him with due respect. Tsukigata was established as a prison town, which means that the roads, Buddhist temples, irrigation canals, all of this was the convicts' work. And this also means that the inhabitants of Tsukigata are benefiting from that labor today. Every year, a memorial service is held by the town on a graveyard where 1,022 convicts are buried. The entire prison covered an area of about 24 square meters, delimited by a black fence 5 meters and a half tall and 15 centimeters thick. The complex contained several detention rooms, 94 administrative buildings, a factory block, and 9 solitaries, where the misbehaved could be confined. During the initial years, the prison would also double down as a medical facility for everyone, prisoners and settlers, and orders from the Minister of the Interior would be spread to the communities from there. It was the most important building in Tsukigata, truly. Moving on to what type of work did the prisoners do, it was mostly the clearing of the land and the cultivation of the soil. There was more agricultural work being done here than in the other 2 prisons. One agricultural area was located along the Ishikari River and worked on daily by around 200 convicts. Another was in Shirayotsu, about 4 kilometers to the southeast of the prison. 400 convicts would work there every day and stay in overnight camps so they didn't need to return to the prison each time. The work conditions were really harsh. The prisoners had to cut through tall, thick bamboo, were bitten by swarms of gadflies, and attacked by brown bears and adders. The following is a quote from a prison guard. "The sky is always cloudy. There is a perpetual low-lying mist. It is not uncommon to not see a single ray of sun for 10 days at a time. In October, frost comes early and is severe, the trees die, and the biting wind rises. In late October or early November, it starts to snow, the water freezes, the mountain streams become white all at once, and the silvery world is revealed. From then on, the snowfall never stops for nearly half a year. Travel across land or water is affected by the cold, and the thermometer drops to temperatures below 0 degrees. The range of plants that the prisoners cultivated was wide. I will leave links in the description for more details. In any case, the ultimate goal was subsistence farming, but crops would often fail due to bad weather, plagues of insects, and lack of fertilizers, so they had to import food from the mainland. Agriculture wasn't the only field of work in Kabato Prison. Convicts would also work wood and iron, burn charcoal, and produce miso and soy sauce. The primary goal was, once again, self-sustenance, although the workshops also accepted outside commissions. Besides these primary industries, convicts dipped their toes on other minor activities over the years, like sewing, straw weaving, cotton picking, production of barrels, shoes, baskets, rope, dye, paper, and the coverings of sliding doors, and brickmaking, although this last endeavor didn't go so well. The Tsukigata Kabato Museum was established in 1972, thanks to the efforts of a man called Shokishiku Magai, local historian and descendant of a warder, who collected the materials that can be seen on the museum nowadays. The main building, which was the headquarters, was destroyed in 1886, but rebuilt and used as the town hall until 1972. The following year, it opened as the Hokkaido Penal Museum. The today renamed Tsukigata Kabato Museum showcases artifacts such as maps, shackles, items used by the convicts like their persimmon-colored uniforms, and so on, while explaining what happened in the prison complex during its 39 years of existence. The first thing you will see upon entering the prison is the portrait of Tsukigata Kiyoshi, the first director of the prison, followed by the portraits of his successors. The man is also immortalized on a statue in front of the main building. Now, prick your ears, because I'm about to reveal to you our most embarrassing moment in Japan. So, about 4 minutes from the museum, there is a new, currently active Kabato prison. Pretty sure you already know where this is going. On the day before we set to Asahikawa, I had looked up the location of the Kabato Museum on Google Maps. So far so good. The next day, when I turned on the directions and started typing, a place immediately popped up and I thought it was the museum. Because, recently researched places get saved up by the system and pop up automatically later. The problem is, it wasn't. It was the Kabato Prison, not the Kabato Prison Museum. When cropped up, they have the same name. And since both places are separated by a distance of 4 minutes by car, that didn't set any alarms either. When father entered the facility, I immediately noticed something was wrong. I had seen the building and it looked nothing like the modern looking one in front of us. But by then it was too late to turn around and the guard was already walking towards us. My father then asked if we could take photos. Remember, my father was still under the impression we were at the museum, and I was on the back seat too mortified to speak. Nothing happened to us, the guard just said no, obviously, and we were on our way, but boy, we probably didn't cause the best of impressions. The Kabato prison guard obviously will never see this video, but if you happen to be Japanese, I am so sorry, we didn't mean to be disrespectful, we were just on the wrong place. About the Kabato Museum, there are 2 important things you need to know. First, photos are not allowed inside, so I can show you anything. Second, everything is in Japanese. There are no translations, partial translations, QR codes, English pamphlets, zit, nothing. The fact there are no translations, coupled with the no photo policy that prevents you from using your phone to help you out, lest they think you're trying to snap some pics, and the fact you can save the labels to read later, make this a pretty brutal place for foreign tourists, so I can recommend it unless you're fluent in Japanese. Fluent, not I watch anime without subtitles sometimes fluent. Not that going to the museum was a waste of time for me, not at all. First of all, the entry fee is pretty sweet because of it not being a touristic place. Secondly, inside there was a fire switch, a device that appears in Golden Kamui and that when turned opens all cells at once, to be used in case a fire breaks out. That was cool to see live. What I liked the most though was browsing through the guest book, filled with the drawings of the visitors. There was a giant Nagakura, 1 page large, Sister Miyazawa of course, Shiraishi and other Golden Kamui characters. It was cute. And finally, I bought this folder, which is so pretty. Sugimoto looking really charming here, and there's a stray cat in the back. I bring this one to work every day with the research pages for my videos in case I can write a bit of the script on a break. The Kabato Prison Museum is often overlooked by those who do the Golden Kamuy pilgrimage, but it is an important place. It was here where the character Shinpachi Nagakura served as a swordsmanship instructor for the guards. It was here where a nun known as Sister Miyazawa came often to provide religious counseling services to the prisoners, and it was here where Shiraishi was locked up at some point, and from where he escaped by deceiving the guards using the shell of a stag beetle. After the Kabato prison, the Sorachi and Kushiro prisons were built. I will sort of gloss over these two, but again, description if you want details. The situation in Sorachi was similar to that in Kabato. Sorachi prison was also the heart of the city, being the only place where people could get medical assistance. Doctors would treat prisoners in the morning and residents in the afternoon. Its premises also served as a school for a while up until 1886, when the actual first school was built. Prisoners did carpentry, basketry, cotton pulling, brickwork, and produced barrels, coal, tatami, miso and soy sauce, paper, matches, dye, rope, and straw, leather, and hemp goods. They also did stone masonry, pounded rice in mortars, and had a sawmill, smithy, and tailor's workshop. Importantly, they also built a dam and a water reservoir. Before, since the groundwater was yellow and unfit for human consumption, both villagers and prisoners had to go draw water from the base of Mikasa Mountain or Ikusumbetsu River, which was exhausting. As for the Kushiro prison, it was a project built on a budget. When it opened on 15 of November 1885, 94 convicts came from the Tokyo, Miyagi, and Sorachi facilities to work on the incomplete prison and expand it, so it could receive the following 110. However, then came the problem of lack of guards, so a nationwide campaign was launched to recruit more. The following is a record of a former guard, Marute Toshio. I came to Shibesha in Meiji 19, when I was 23 years old. At the time, Hokkaido was known as Ezo, and when you said you were going to Ezo, this meant you would never return, because wolves and bears would attack you. I came here from Yokohama by boat, traveling with a group of 170 others from Kagoshima. When I arrived in Kushiro, I saw mountains and hills everywhere, and I asked myself, whatever had I come here for? When I looked around me, I saw houses showing underneath the snow, and was alarmed at the thought that rice would certainly not grow here, asking myself how people could eat here. At the time, there were no more than 200 households in the area of the Kushiro harbor. As we arrived at this harbor, we started out to Shibesha on foot. People told us we had to walk 12 ri on foot, and there was no road or anything. Then, all 170 men went up the river in boats that had been waiting for us, and I was surprised when we were finally told we had arrived in Shibesha. Then we got 8 Ainu as errand boys to help us. The hair of these Ainu was so thick that it was impossible to tell whether they had eyes. I thought we would be afraid of the Ainu, but the Ainu saw us and were frightened. When we later asked why the Ainu were frightened when seeing us, we were answered that our Kagoshima costumes were surprising. We were dressed in short garments made of tapped cotton fabric, which did not cover our ankles. So many people answered the call that for a month there were 3 or 4 guards per prisoner. Kushiro was the only prison in Hokkaido who tried wet rice cultivation and succeeded somewhat. This interesting relationship between townfolk and convicts, with each shaping the other's environment, lasted for about 5 years. And although the conditions were hard due to the very nature of Hokkaido, the labor assignments of prison inmates were carried out somewhat moderately. As a result, development was slow. But everything changed in 1886, when Ito Hirobumi sent government official Kaneko Kentaro to Hokkaido to do an inspection. The scholar was not impressed. And 2 months later, upon his return to Tokyo, he wrote a report vouching for the abolishment of the three-ken government and its replacement with a central administration, Hokkaido Sho. About the prisons, he said the following, and I will proceed to read the full quote. Road routes have already been determined and fully surveyed, and as soon as the budget structure for the costs of rural development has been announced, it will be necessary to begin work quickly. At least 10 ri, or more of densely forested area, must be felled along the route, dark mountain ridges flattened, and water conduits dug into the valleys. If common laborers are hired for these extremely arduous tasks and are unable to bear the workload, we will be in a situation where wages will rise to a very high level. For this reason, prisoners from the prefectures of Sapporo and Nemuru should be relocated and deployed here. These are rough woodlooms by nature, and if they are unable to bear the work and are broken by it, then the situation is no different than that of common laborers, who leave behind wives and children and whose remains must be interred in the ground. And furthermore, if, as is the case today, there are a great number of hardened criminals and the steadily rising cost of imprisonment must be financed by the government, then these convicts should be put to work in these important sectors. If they are unable to bear it and perish, then it is, in light of today's situation, in which reports are made on the extreme difficulty of funding prisons, to be considered a politically strategic reduction of these persons that can take place in no other way. Furthermore, if we are to compare the wages of a common laborer with that of a prisoner, we see that the daily wage of laborers in Hokkaido is no less than 40 zeni, while prisoners receive no more than 18 zeni per day. In the case that prison labor is used, a great portion of the cost of development would be saved in comparison to the use of common laborers. This I call killing two birds with one stone. Today, dangerous criminals with more than 10 years of incarceration are sent to Hokkaido, where they are given accommodations, clothing and food, all things that must be imported from central Japan at an extraordinarily high cost. The work methods are no different than those of minor criminals. This preferential treatment and waiting for the day of repentance, upon which the intention is to turn them into residents, not only hinders how these hardened criminals are disciplined, it is also disadvantageous for the government. Therefore, I ask that such convicts are gated and put to such arduous tasks that common laborers cannot bear. In simpler words, Kaneko Kentaro didn't give a damn about the prisoners. He didn't even really see them as human beings. He wanted results, and he wanted them fast. He knew that building roads at such high speed would probably cause deaths, but it was okay because the ones dying would be criminals. He even said the convicts wouldn't leave behind children or wives, and that, therefore, wouldn't need to be buried. Which was actually not even true, because there were those among them who had families. Kaneko also showed disdain for Ito's ideals and previous accomplishments. He saw inmates as parasites, despite the fact that they were trying to be self-sufficient by producing all they needed and by attempting subsistence farming. With this sort of views, it's not surprising that he didn't believe in rehabilitation either. That's probably the main difference between him and his less influential contemporaries. We already know what Ito's goals were, but even Yamagata Aritomo, which was in support of intensifying prison labor, hoped that by being subjected to it, the prisoners would turn a new leaf. But not Kaneko Kentaro. For him, criminals were criminals. Now, in all fairness, nasty things were already in motion even before the construction of the roads. We are going to talk about it before we move to the post-1886 era. When I say nasty things, in this context, I'm referring to what happened in the Oronai coal mines and in the sulfur mountain of Atosanopuri. The coal deposits in Oronai were discovered in 1873 by an American engineer called Benjamin Smith Lehman. The initial plan was to send the Ainu from Sakhalin, who had lost their homes, to explore the mines, but they were saved from this destiny by a judge named Matsumoto Juro. I mentioned this earlier in the video. The duty then fell over the shoulders of the prisoners of Sorachi. 1 year after the opening of the prison, 60 convicts were sent to the mines. Then more and more. The men chosen were between 20 and 40, with sturdy builds and long-term sentences of over 12 years. By 1885, prisoners made up 37% of the workforce, the rest being regular contracted coal miners. 3 years later, that percentage had risen to 78%. This exploration of cheap labor made it so that the coal could be exported for very low prices. In fact, it was the cheapest on the Asian markets. Low prices, more buyers, more profit for the company. Obviously, there were reasons why it was so hard to recruit regular workers. Work was carried out in 2 shifts of 12 hours, day and night, with workers exchanging shifts every week. The inside of the mines was suffocatingly tight, forcing the men to work lying down and crawl on their bellies. But worst of all was the unbreathable air, contaminated with coal dust and the flammable gases that could make spaces go boom in an instant. Since the prisoners always had to use their uniforms, even when they were soaked with water and sweat, they stank really badly. In the summer of 1893, a doctor from the Tokyo University, Okada Asahiro, visited the site and reported the following. The foul and putrid drinking water is unfit for human consumption. For this reason, the prisoners fall ill from digestive diseases, chronic stomach problems, and diarrhea. There is no separation between the latrines and the places where meals are eaten, and the prisoners breathe dust and bad air polluted by coal dust and gases. And sure, this is all very concerning, but there were other issues that needed to be looked into according to this very same doctor, including the fact that the place was very propitious to escape attempts, that prisoners and regular workers would secretly exchange meals even though it was forbidden, resulting in prisoners eating better food than they deserved, and that they were fermenting leftover rice to turn it into sake in the depths of the mines. Thanks to the Sino-Japanese War, news about coal production and coal mining started appearing more, and the government had to abolish prison labor in Tondenhei to not face public backlash. Between 1883 and 1891, 81 convicts died, and 3,301 got injured while working in the mines. Of those, half also walked away with eye diseases. A lot got blind or crippled. Meanwhile, around the time this was happening, the administration of the Sulphur Mountain, near Lake Kushiro, had just been given to a banker from Hakodate, Yamada Sakuro. In 1886, Yamada made a deal with the director of the Kushiro prison, Inoue. As per contract, 500 convicts would work for 10 years on sulfur extraction and would receive a daily wage of 15 sen. This was a downgrade from the 18 sen they were receiving by working in road construction, and this job was way more dangerous. Interestingly, Yamada failed to make a profit, even with the use of almost free labor. In 1877, the sulfur mines changed hands. The new guy, Yasuda, modernized the operations by ordering the construction of a railway between the mines and the refinery in Shibesha, a 40 kilometers road between Shibesha and Kushiro, the widening of the Kushiro River for transportation via steamboat, and the installation of telephone lines. Success came this time. The sulfur from Kushiro became well recognized worldwide for its quality. But behind this was death. In half a year only, 30 prisoners died from dropsy caused by undernourishment, and a lot became blind. Every single one of them, and the guards too, were affected by the sulfur gas and particles in some way or another. Apparently, some prison guards were also particularly cruel, and would put down collapsed convicts with their swords. Accidental death, or death due to an escape attempt, would say the records. Finally, in 1888, Christian prison minister Ara Taneaki visited the site, and was horrified by what he saw. So much so, he immediately reunited with Inoue, the prison director, to plead for the prisoners. It is said that Inoue was deeply moved by Taneaki's words. This might be true or not, but the fact is that Inoue cancelled the contract with Yasuda prematurely. and that's how the prisoners got to leave the sulfur mountain of Atosanopuri. Taniaki eventually moved to Kushiro to work there as a Christian prison chaplain and was able to introduce catechesis on all central prisons of Hokkaido. Despite Taniaki's interventions thought, it was still not over. But that I will leave to talk about when we reach Abashiri, the main stage of the final act. As for us, we had just left Kabato behind and we were in a race against time because there were 2 places we wanted to visit in Asahikawa before nightfall. And for reference, most places close at 5 PM, with last entry at 4:30 PM. We ended up skipping lunch. The first thing that may come to your mind when I say Asahikawa, if you know the place at all, is the military. The Asahikawa village was formed in 1890 as a Tondenhei, farmer militia settlement. This is a base whose primary goal was to defend the north against potential invaders. In 1922, its state was elevated to that of a city, and it's now the second largest in Hokkaido after Sapporo, with an airport that serves domestic destinations and flights to South Korea. When World War II started, the 7th Division, an infantry division in the Imperial Japanese Army, was posted there, and during the final stages of the war, it was bombed by the American naval aircraft. After the war, Asahikawa developed as an industrial center, becoming known for its production of lumber, sake, paper, and furniture. Nowadays, it holds the headquarters of the 2nd Division of the Northern Army of the Japan Ground Self-Defense Force. Asahikawa means Asai River, or Morning Sun River, but its old Ainu name was River of Waves, Shiupet, which the Japanese mistook for Shukpet, Sun River. That's how the name came to be. In any case, Asahikawa is very riveresque indeed, with its 130 rivers and streams and over 740 bridges, the most famous of all being Asashibashi, who crosses over the Ishikari River and is a local symbol. As every other main city in Hokkaido, Asahikawa also has a winter festival, held on the bank of the Ishikari River. But if you decide to attend, keep in mind that Asahikawa holds the record for the coldest temperature in Japanese history, a whopping minus 41 degrees Celsius, minus 41.8 Fahrenheit, registered in January of 1902. Its cold climate and its mountains thought make Asahikawa a perfect place for ski resorts, and there's plenty of that in the outskirts of the city. It is also a cradle of sculptures and other artists. The station main road, called Eiwa Road, is full of statues, and there is a museum that pays homage to the famous sculptor Teijiro Nakahara, where you can see his works of the artists who inspired him, like Auguste Rodin and Morie Ogihara, and the sculptures of those who won the Teijiro Nakahara Award, or that are associated with Asahikawa or Hokkaido in general. Other museums include the Asahikawa Science Center, the Otokoyama Sakezukuri Museum, the Kaneto Kawamura Ainu Museum, and the Asahikawa Museum of Art. More popular than the museums is the Asahiyama Zoo, a city icon, and the most northern zoo in Japan. Speaking of animals, Asahikawa has 2 mascots, Azapi and Yukuri. Azapi is a hybrid of a harbor seal and a polar bear. He wears a shirt with fringes that resemble ramen, because soy-based ramen is a typical Asahikawa dish, and his belt is designed after the Ishikari River. Yukuri is a snow giraffe, or a kirin. She wears a tambetsu boots with fringes, and her antennae resemble snowballs. And finally, Asahikawa is also one of the places where you can see tambo art, or rice paddy art. Rice paddy art is a recent art form that uses rice strains of different colors, white, yellow, red, purple, green, to create living artwork on a massive scale. When planted in the paddies, the colored rice forms detailed images when viewed from above. This tradition originated in the village of Inakadate, in the Aomori prefecture. As it happened in many places, in Japan it also came a time when the youth left the countryside to go and try to find work in the city. Inakadate saw its population shrink, and although the government sent funds to help the struggling communities in the 1980s, when that funding stopped, the village had to find new ways of generating income. First, they built a rice museum, but it didn't attract many visitors, so it didn't bring the village enough money. Then Koichi Anada, an employee at the Inakadate Town Hall, came with the idea of the rice paddy heart, while watching the children play in the colored fields. Anada and 20 more town hall workers created the first image made with rice in 1993, Mount Yaki in two colors. The work was made all by hand. Since the image was plain on paper, the result could have been better and the dimensions more accurate. But Anada and the others learned from the mistake and started doing the planning on a computer instead. They also asked for volunteers to help plant the fields the following times, and the village was more than willing to help. Hundreds answered the call, and it became a big local event. To keep things organized, markers are added to each area, indicating the color of rice that needs to be planted there. That way, the people working on the field only need to follow the directions. Given the success of the tambo heart in Inakadate, other rural villages decided to follow the example and make their own rice drawings. If you ever go to Japan, you can find these on Asahikawa, Yonezawa, Shibata, Akitakata, and Nagahama. Of course, you have to go during the right season, late May to early June, generally. In April, we couldn't see tambo heart. What we got to see was the Hokuchin Memorial and the Asahikawa City Museum. The Hokuchin Memorial Museum tells the story of the Tondenhei, the farmer soldiers sent to settle on Hokkaido, remember? As well as the story of the 7th Division of the old Imperial Japanese Army and the activities of the current 2nd Division of the JGSDF. The facility, which opened in 1963, is administered by the Asahikawa General Service Unit, and the current curator of the museum is Captain Izuki Moriyama. You don't have to pay anything to visit, and the museum has many things, apparently over 2,500 artifacts, so it's very well worthy. Outside, you can see the gate piers of the original headquarters of the 7th Division, from 92, which were transferred here. Once inside, they will want to get some data from you, for their statistics, for example, where you are from. There is also a screen at the entrance where you can see yourself in manga style, with uniform or other filters. I will use what can be found in this museum to tell you a bit about the 7th Division and its work over the ages. Starting with this painting, one of the most famous items, the Kunimi no Zu. This picture depicts Yamamura Mishitoshi, who would become the governor of Hokkaido, and Nagayame Takeshiro, the first general of the 7th Division and the founder of the Tondenhei Army, in 1885, looking over Kamikawa Basin at dawn. This represents the moment they decided to move the army corps from Shikabumi to the Kamikawa Highlands. The 7th Division was formed in Sapporo in May 1888. Their debut in battle happened during the Russo-Japanese War. They were called on August 4, 1904, and joined the war from the third full-scale attack on November 27, having participated in the siege of Port Arthur and the Battle of Mukden. The Russo-Japanese War started for territorial reasons, as you probably know, with both Russia and Japan wanting to expand their spheres of influence and exert dominance over the less civilized people of mainland Asia. Japan made a proposal: Manchuria for Russia and Korea for them. When Russia refused and negotiations went south, Japan launched a surprise attack on the Russian Pacific Fleet at Port Arthur, thus starting the war. The Japanese troops landed in Korea, then crossed the Yalu River into Manchuria. In August, they laid siege to Port Arthur, which fell half a year later, and in March of the following year, 1905, took Mukden, Manchuria's capital. This Japanese victory had huge political consequences, the most notable of them Japan emerging as a great power. Russia's loss also caused great internal turmoil, which likely contributed to the Russian Revolution of 95. Of course, this is a gross oversimplification of the whole situation, but I want to focus on the 7th Division only, so we don't have time for many details. I will leave that for the future. And so we return to Asahikawa for a moment of respite between conflicts. In February 1912, Lieutenant Colonel Lersch from the Austrian Self-Defense Forces was assigned to the artillery regiment stationed in Asahikawa, and he gave the people of Hokkaido the first skiing lesson on the 20th of February. Soldiers, postal workers, reporters, and others all came to attend. After a quick period in Manchuria, the 7th Division was dispatched to Siberia to support the White Russian forces and the Czechoslovak Legion against Soviet Russia. This event was called the Siberian Intervention or Siberian Expedition and happened between the years of 1918 and 1920, during the Russian Civil War. The territory of Primorsky Krai, controlled by the Japanese, became a stronghold for the White armies. In October of 1922, the Red Army invaded and captured Vladivostok, the administrative center of Primorsky Krai, forcing the White and their allies to flee to Korea, which was under Japanese domain at that time, and the Japanese archipelago. The White forces lost the war to the Red ones. The 7th Division returned to Asahikawa on 5 May 1919, and no incidents occurred until 1931. On September 18 of that year, Lieutenant Suemori Kawamoto of the 29th Japanese Infantry Regiment detonated a small quantity of dynamite close to a railway owned by Japan South Manchuria Railway near Mukden. The explosion didn't cause any damage, but the incident was blamed on the Chinese and used as an excuse for a full-on invasion that culminated with the Japanese turning Manchuria into a puppet state called Manchukuo. The situation would only change in 1945, towards the end of the Second World War. Tensions between the Empire of Japan and the Republic of China heightened as a result of the invasion, especially because afterwards the Japanese forces extended their control further into northern China, seeking to obtain raw materials. By July 1937, Japan had expanded its forces in China to an estimated 7,000 to 15,000 men, mostly along railways, a number that far exceeded what was allowed by the protocol in force at that time. On the night of 7 July, the Japanese units stationed at Fengtai crossed the border to conduct military exercises. Japanese and Chinese forces outside the town of Wenping, a town 16.4 kilometers southwest of Beijing, exchanged fire at approximately 11 p.m. When a Japanese soldier, Shimuru Kikujiro, failed to return to his post, Chinese regimental commander Ji Xingwen received a message from the Japanese demanding permission to enter Wenping to search for the missing soldier, but the Chinese refused. Shimura appeared later. He claimed that he was suffering from a stomach ache and that he had gotten lost while trying to find a place away from his post to relieve himself. There is also the possibility that he was in a brothel. By that time, both sides were mobilizing, with the Japanese deploying reinforcements to surround Wenping. Although the ceasefire was eventually declared, the situation kept escalating, thus why this incident is regarded by some as the one that started the Second Sino-Japanese War, which only ended on 2 September 1945, when the Japanese surrendered after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But the 7th Division wasn't involved directly in the war against the Chinese. I just wanted to give you some context since the Battles of Khalkhin Gol and the following conflicts happen amidst this, as in parallel to this. What I'm going to talk about next happens after Japan took Manchuria and invaded China. At that time, Mongolia was a communist state allied with the Soviet Union, known as the Mongolian People's Republic. But the borders between the Mongolian People's Republic and Manchukuo, aka Manchuria, weren't clear. According to the Japanese, the border between the two regions was the Khalkhin Gol River, but the Mongolians and their Soviet allies would insist that the actual border was 16 kilometers to the east instead. This led to the Battles of Khalkhin Gol, named after the Khalkhin Gol River, which crossed the battlefield. In Japan, it also came to be known as the Nomohan Incident. The main participant from the Japanese side was the Kwantung Army, which was stationed at Manchukuo. This army had some of the best units of Japan at the time, but it wasn't without flaws. For instance, in the western region of Manchukuo, there was the 23rd Infantry Division, the newest and least experienced division in the entire Kwantung Army. Besides being green to battle, they had also been given outdated equipment. The Khalkhin Gol battles began on 11 May 1939. At some point, the 7th Division was sent to help the 23rd Division. By September, they had arrived at the front lines. But that very same September, the Soviet Union and Japan agreed to a ceasefire. The battles ended with the loss of the Japanese. It is worth mentioning that the Kwantung Army acted against the wishes of the central government when initiating and escalating the conflict, and this greatly displeased the Tokyo officials. The Kwantung Army made it so that the North Strike Group lost support from Tokyo, the North Strike Group being the ones that believed Japan should expand their domain towards the north and seize Siberia for its resources. After the battles of Khalkhin Gol, support shifted to the South Strike Group, who wanted to seize the resources of Southeast Asia. And so Japan invaded French Indochina in 1940 and attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Over the following 6 months, Japan kept capturing territory after territory, up until the naval battle of Midway, which they lost. This battle is considered a key turning point in the war. The Japanese wanted to ambush the US, but thanks to codebreakers, the US already knew when and where the attack would occur, so they laid down an ambush of their own. Both sides suffered significant losses, but while the Americans were able to recover their naval air strength in a relatively short amount of time, the Japanese were unable to do so. And since the museum has an area dedicated to a specific man, I shall mention him as well. Tateo Kato, nicknamed Hayabusa Kato. He was born in Asahikawa and became a local hero due to his exceptional flying skills that earned him 7 commendations from the Emperor. He was one of the aces on the expansionist battles of the Japanese Empire, having fought both in the Second Sino-Japanese War and the Second World War. He was particularly impressive during the Battle of Malaya, but ended up dying while fighting over the Bay of Bengal against the Bristol Blenheim bombers of the enemy. Kato was promoted 2 ranks posthumously, the first officer of the Imperial Japanese Army Air Service to receive such an honor. Now back to the war. The 28th Infantry of the 7th Division had been assigned to invade Midway, so they were on their way when they received the news about the defeat. Since there was no point in going to Midway anymore, the whole regiment was rerouted to Guadalcanal instead, which is located on the Solomon Islands. It is interesting to note that the 7th Division was specialized in Arctic warfare. They were used to fighting in the cold. To be relocated to the hot and humid Pacific, and in August of all months, it was quite a change in environment. The Guadalcanal Campaign marked the Allies' transition from defensive operations to offensive ones. The Japanese had begun constructing bases on Guadalcanal and nearby islands to protect Japan's major naval base at Rabaul. These bases were also a threat to the Allied supply and communication lines, so it was imperative to not let things advance. The expedition started with a so-called midnight raid on Guadalcanal. Due to severe storms and heavy clouds, the Allied forces were able to approach without being seen, which gave them an advantage. The Allies split into two groups, with one group assaulting Guadalcanal and the other Tulagi, Florida, and other nearby islands. Under the command of Colonel Kiyonao Ishiki, 917 soldiers landed at Taivu Point after midnight on 19 August. Ishiki underestimated the Allied forces on Guadalcanal and tried a nighttime frontal assault. The American had been warned about the impending attack by a scout dot, so they were ready. The Japanese suffered a heavy defeat, and it is said that Ishiki committed seppuku after realizing the magnitude of their losses. This was the Battle of the Tenaru. The Battle of Edson's Ridge was another big event that didn't go well for the Japanese. It happened as a result of an attempt of the Japanese to surround and annihilate enemies in the vicinity of the Guadalcanal Island airfield. The plan designed by General Kawaguchi was to split forces and attack from three fronts. However, on 18 September, US troops discovered Kawaguchi's main supply depot and gathered from the captured documents that the Japanese were planning a large-scale ground assault on the airfield soon. They successfully predicted where the main attack would take place. This is Lunga Ridge, a coral ridge that runs parallel to the Lunga River. Kawaguchi lost about 850 men, while Colonel Edson from the US Marine Forces suffered only 104 losses. There were many battles after that. These are just two of the most significant ones. The Japanese ended up evacuating from Guadalcanal. Their last troops left the island on the evening of 7 February. By the way, do you remember when I said Japan had tried to invade Midway? Around the time this was happening, Japan also launched an attack against the Aleutian Islands, Attu and Kiska, located in Alaska. This operation was nicknamed AL. A detachment of the 7th Division was involved in this. Midway, Attu and Kiska, these were all strategic points that would allow the Japanese to monitor attacks from the US. Eventually, it was determined that the Imperial Army would invade Attu and the Imperial Navy would invade Kiska. The forces, consisting of approximately 1,000 men and headed by Major Matsutoshi Ozumi, invaded Kiska on 60 June and took control of Attu and its population the next day. The 41 Aleut inhabitants who survived the Japanese invasion were taken to a prison camp near Otaru, and 16 died while imprisoned. After landing, the soldiers began constructing an airbase and fortifications. Attempts to retake the islands started on 11 May 1943. The following day, the US was able to sink Japanese submarine I-31. The Allied forces under General John L. DeWitt had Attu under control by the end of the month. American forces lost 549 men, and from the Japanese, all but 29 were killed. And we are approaching the end of the war now, and the Japanese are on the defensive. In 1944, the troops in Hokkaido built a network of pillboxes from Nemuru to Kushiro, pillboxes being small fortified structures with very small holes, from where the people inside can open fire against approaching enemies. But Japan's surrender comes the next year, and with that, the 7th Division is finally disbanded. As a final note, I will mention the non-warfare related actions of the 7th Division, namely its intervention after natural disasters, such as an eruption of Mount Tokashi and the Great Kanto earthquake of 1923, a 7.9 magnitude earthquake who provoked several fires that decimated most of Tokyo and virtually all of Yokohama. More than 110,000 people died, and nearly 1.5 million became homeless. After this catastrophe, the 7th Division was also involved in drills to prepare and educate the people of Hokkaido, so they know how to react in cases like this. Nowadays, the division that is stationed at Asahikawa is the 2nd Division of the Japan Ground Self-Defense Force. They are the ones responsible for the protection of the current northwestern Hokkaido. The division was founded in January 1962. We finished our visit in the souvenir shop. Since the 7th Division is such an important part of the Golden Kamuy story, there is a lot of geeky merch. I bought several sets of plastic stands because I wanted to have as many characters as physically possible represented on my Golden Kamui sanctuary, let's call it that for lack of a better word. I don't have all the characters, but as you can see, it's a fair collection. My father got a bag with Sugimoto's rank on the military, which is Private First Class, Itohei, the lowest on the hierarchy. And best of all, I also got this Shiraishi plushie. Shiraishi was the only character available, but I'm not complaining. I'm lucky there was a character in the first place. They could have been all sold out. Now, the cool thing about this plushie is that it comes with a change of clothes. You can dress him with the uniform of the 7th Division. He did this on the anime once to go undercover, and the uniform is handmade. The military lady that runs the shop makes this on a sewing machine, which she has fully decorated with Tanigaki merchandise, because Tanigaki is her favorite character. Meanwhile, I'm an Ogata girl. I shouldn't, don't be like me. Tanigaki is clearly the better choice, but what can I say? I love all cats, even the traumatized ones. We actually attempted to communicate a bit, the military lady and I, because we are both such huge GK fans, and I'm sure we would have had great discussions about lore and whatnot if my Japanese was better, but it was still really nice. We finished shopping and ran to the Asahikawa City Museum. This museum covers the history, culture and nature of northern Hokkaido. Since it's such a broad topic, I will not be teaching you anything this time, I will just show you what you can find in this museum. And after all of what you can find here, I already talked about it on past videos, or I will very soon. So, the Asahikawa City Museum has 2 floors, the first floor and the basement floor, and in the center of it all, there is an atrium with tall trees. Anyway, the entrance is on the first floor, where you start by learning about the Ainu and their evolution throughout the times, from the ancient to the modern days. You can see representations of the Ainu people doing different activities such as hunting, fishing, crafting, and even farming, as well as real-size recreations of Ainu dwellings, one old and one new. There are also several artifacts and ornaments in exposition. At the end of the corridor, you can learn about the current Ainu trading networks in Northeast Asia, and on the other side there is a real-size model of a Tondenhei house. Other aboriginal peoples of Northeastern Asia besides the Ainu are also touched upon briefly. Meanwhile, the basement floor is mostly dedicated to the fauna, flora and geology of the Kamikawa region, as well as the techniques that the living beings, including humans, use to survive the extreme cold. And finally, there is also a section dedicated to the Paleolithic and Jomon eras. These photos would have come in handy when I made all those videos about Japan's prehistory. Would be really happy if you check them out, by the way, they are very detailed. After this quite exhausting day, we headed to the low-cost Tabis Diversity Hotel. Between the check-in and the time it took for me to wash and dry my long hair, we left for dinner quite late at night, so it was a struggle to find a place to eat in. Remember, this is Asahikawa, not Tokyo. But I really had to wash my hair, I hadn't done so ever since arriving in Hokkaido. That late at night, the only places open were a sort of izakayas, cloudy with cigarette smoke. You see, in Japan, you cannot smoke on the streets and inside most establishments, which I do appreciate as someone who is allergic to tobacco. On the other hand, they have these places where smokers can talk, grab a bite, and that are open when most places are already closed. We found about 3 or 4 of these very smoky places, and then finally came across a fast food tempura establishment called Katsuya. A bit too heavy for dinner, in terms of grease content, but we weren't in the mood for kombini food after having skipped lunch. Yeah, those onigiri we ate at breakfast, they carried us hard. When we arrived back at the hotel, our previous parking spot was gone, and while leaving the lot, my father hit the car on one of those, I don't know the word for it in English, but one of those wide, shallow stone vases at the side of the sidewalk. It was a very nasty hit, just look at his damage. If we didn't have insurance, we would be cooked. In my father's defense, it was almost midnight, so we were all about to drop. The parking lot was dark, and given how colorful the edges of that vase were, he wasn't the first or the second to eat that horribly located thing. Besides that incident, the rest of the night went by peacefully. I slept in a Japanese-style room, and the futon was comfortable enough. Oh, and I have to mention this because it's hilarious. In the corridor, they had a sign that stated the following: "Smoking is not allowed. If you don't follow the rules, you will be fined." So yeah, they wanted the word fined with a D. Thought you would appreciate this little gem. Anyway, in the next morning, we went to the Aeon Commercial Center to exchange money. The exchange rate was less favorable than the one at the Haneda airport thought. So people say that you lose money if you do exchange at airports, but there are places where it's more expensive. We ate breakfast at a nearby coffee shop called Yoshinori. Since it was still too early, there was only one option available: a small cup of pork soup and the drink. Better than no breakfast at all. And we were off to Abashiri. I'll talk about Abashiri in the next video. The one thing I want to focus on right now is just the Abashiri prison, because it is the stage of the final act of the story of convict forced labor in Japan. So, as I already mentioned, the government really wanted that central road that would revolutionize Hokkaido, and they wanted it for yesterday. In March 1890, the director of the Kushiro prison, or Inoue, was told the convicts of his prison would be the ones responsible for the construction of the 235 kilometers long road between Shubetsubutu, current Asahikawa, and Kitami, current Abashiri. And it just occurred to me all of a sudden, but did I already tell you why Japan's government was such in a hurry to get the road done? I don't recall, so I apologize if I'm repeating myself, but it is quite important, so I can risk leaving it unsaid. Basically, it was because Japan was afraid that Russia would launch an attack on them. One of the governors of the Hokkaido Sho, Nagayama Takeshiro, traveled to Russia in 1888, and upon his return, he stated that Japan was in great danger, and that they needed to settle in Hokkaido for real, once and for all, especially in the northern regions closest to Russia. And in order to do that, they needed the road. Road which was already being built, but only at a speed of 10 ri per year. Nagayama then crafted a new plan of action. In this plan, 45 ri of road needed to be built in a year. So from 39 kilometers a year to around 175. This is more than 4 times the speed, I think. Around 800 Abashiri prisoners were chosen for this job. The prisoners were divided into 4 groups of 200, and each group was led by a head guard, 2 supervision assistants, and 12 regular guards. Because they needed someone who knew what they were doing, they also added 30 civilians who were specialized in construction. Finally, there were also 20 Ainu who would provide the food. The work would go like this. First, the prisoners would fell the trees, and then they would use the logs of said trees to lay the road. Sounds simple enough, but Hokkaido's topography is a beach, so the route was full of steep cliffs and hard rocks that needed to be blown away with dynamite. The entire route was divided in 13 sections of about 3.5 ri each. 13 sections, 4 groups. And here the Japanese did something very clever. The 4 groups would work simultaneously, each on the respective section given to them, but the leader of the fastest group was given the privilege of choosing where his group would work next. And obviously, everyone wanted the section that went through plain fields, not the one full of rocks and cliffs, so there was competition going on among the work groups. Because of the deadline, the convicts were forced to work from 3 a.m. to 7 p.m. They also weren't being fed properly, and there was a shortage of drinkable water. Due to all of this combined, dropsy took the lives of 156 people. 2 more died of stomach illnesses, and 1 prisoner committed suicide. There were several measures in place to try and prevent escape attempts. One such measure was to have the prisoners' feet chained together in pairs. Another was to have them all dressed in orange, because it was a vibrant color that contrasted greatly with the white of the snow and the green of the forests. In fact, the color orange itself became associated with the prison system in people's minds, so it was avoided. There was even one man that was wrongly imprisoned and subjected to interrogation because he was seen wearing orange socks and was reported as an escapee. This was reported in the Mainichi, one of the most famous Japanese newspapers. Despite all of these, escape attempts occurred almost daily, the great majority ending with the guards capturing and sometimes executing the transgressor with the stab of a sword or a pistol shot. The dead would be buried without ceremony on the side of the road. Even the ones who were successful in their attempt would often return to the camp later, for they were so weak they could not survive in the wilderness or travel great distances. The Abashiri prisoners ended up meeting the Sorachi inmates, who had been working on the road towards them from the south in September of 1891. The hard part was over, and in early December the road was reported as completed according to the plan. A total of 292 lives were lost during the construction of this road. Of these, 232 were Abashiri prisoners, 54 were Sorachi prisoners, and 6 were Abashiri guards. Because yes, even guards died, although I couldn't find the exact causes of their deaths. Probably illness caused by the harsh conditions. This could have been the end of the story, but there was one last prison built in Hokkaido, the Tokashi prison, run by director Watanabe Koriaki. The purpose of this prison was to stimulate rural development of the area. 60 prisoners were therefore moved from Abashiri and Sorachi to this new prison and tasked with the development of 3,500 hectares of land around Obihiru and 100 hectares around Nukabira. Another 700 worked on the last road in Hokkaido to be built by prison labor, a road 44 kilometers long, linking the ports of Ootsu, Obihiru, and Nemuru. In total, Hokkaido inmates built 724 kilometers of road, 1,474 houses for Tondenhei, and reclaimed 70 million square meters of agricultural land. Then the prison system suffered another reform, so things changed greatly again. This change came about due to many different reasons. Reports about the conditions at prison labor sites started to feature on the news, bringing awareness. Of all the prisoners, some were intellectuals, capable of reading and writing, so once out of the prison, they started to publish prison journals in political newspapers and magazines, disclosing what they had gone through. The academics working in social sciences and humanities were also pleading for a change. Even the director of the Abashiri prison, Arima, was shocked by the massive number of deaths that the construction of the central road had caused, and didn't want such brutality to happen again. Another key event was the arrival in Japan of the German criminologist Kurt von Seebach in 1889. For his lectures inspired people all over Japan. He was against prisoners working outside the prison premises and believed all punishments should be applied inside the prison. And interestingly, the fear Hokkaido people had of escapees, fear that had been fed over and over again by the constant stories featured in the media, ended up playing a part as well. The goal of the government was likely to erode the relationship people previously had with the inmates in the pre-1886 era, so they would be seen as the enemy. But this ended up backfiring, because now people were so afraid that they believed that it would be safer for everyone if prisoners weren't allowed outside. And so in 1894, the use of prison labor on outside activities was finally abolished. It was also decided that prisoners that were about to be released would be transferred to prisons in Honshu shortly before the big day, so that they wouldn't be roaming free in Hokkaido. The communities didn't want them, so the government didn't have a choice. This is very ironic, since all of this started because Ito Hirobumi was hoping that the prisoners would settle in Hokkaido after their release and help populate the area. In the end, The prisoners were neither rehabilitated, nor did they become a part of the settler community of Hokkaido. For many, many years afterwards, this negative perception didn't change. When people thought of a criminal, they would picture a dangerous and deranged individual that wanted to escape prison in order to attack people indiscriminately. The locals also didn't like the prisons themselves, and the fact their communities were associated with them. They thought that they gave Hokkaido a bad reputation, and were therefore preventing people from wanting to immigrate there. It didn't help that the majority of those who did immigrate were young males looking for a job as guards, because this led to the construction of many betting houses, sake bars, and similar places. This is establishments that looked innocent at a first glance, but that were a facade for prostitution. It was only in the mid-1960s that people grew aware of how much of the modernization of Hokkaido was thanks to the prisoners and how inhumanely they were treated. When the official celebrations of the centenary of Hokkaido's development failed to mention the prisoners' contribution, Shigematsu Kazuyoshi published in response the history of prison sentencing in Hokkaido. Locals also started movements to shed light on the prisoners' hidden contributions to the development of the island, especially as the centenary of the construction of the Central Road approached. In 1989, the 36th exhibition of the Museum of the Development of Hokkaido was dedicated to the Central Hokkaido prisons and what they accomplished. But the evolution of people's way of thinking gets ever so more evident when we look at the different memorials that were built in honor of the convicts between the years of 1905 and 1985. This is a table depicting 6 memorials that were erected. The first monument was built in Setose. After a flood, the grave post that was marking the place where 67 convicts were buried was washed away, and so a local resident named Sato Toshishi took the initiative to put a large stone in its place, where the words Mountain God, Yamagami were engraved. It is said that the reason why the people of Setose decided to carve the name of a deity on the stone was because they were afraid that no one would pray next to it if they knew it was marking the place where prisoners were buried. At the time, people didn't see them as victims or martyrs. The intentions of the memorials that were built many decades later are a lot more overt, with the exception of the fourth, whose name is just Shane Mount Memorial. This one was erected near Abashiri by the citizens of Tanosho, and its name comes from the fact that when excavations were done on the site, people discovered human remains with chains attached to the leg bones, thus Shane Mount Memorial. You might also have noticed that the last memorial uses the word victims, Gisheisha, instead of martyrs, Junansha. This is because while both words imply sacrifice, a martyr is someone who suffers greatly for a cause or belief, meaning that there is at least a degree of free will involved. Because the prisoners were forced to work, many community members felt the word victim was more appropriate. The one responsible for the building of the memorial, the Buddhist nun Ayashi Ryuko, even wanted to use the word Korosha, which means a person who rendered great service to the community or nation. But the city hall refused her request. And after all, a Kurosha gains satisfaction from their actions. Their work is meaningful to them, so it wouldn't make sense to use the word in this situation. Ayasha Ryuko spent her childhood on an area where convicts had been used for forced labor, and this greatly affected her. She had nightmares where she was hunted by the dead prisoners, so she believed that they were trying to communicate they wanted to be mourned and to receive proper burials. Later in life, she tried to console the tormented souls by placing statues of Shizo, a bodhisattva, on places where she believed they might have been buried. She then joined the Russo-Japanese Town Local History Society and the Mizuo Societies and set out on a total of 3 expeditions to try and find remains, but only one of these turned out to be successful. After many years of work and dedication, she realized her dream of erecting a monument for those lost 6 feet under, in the year of 1985. Now, the thing about exploitation is that it never truly ends. It just evolves. So eventually, convict labor was replaced with other forms of oppression. To wrap things up, let me briefly tell you about taco labor and foreign labor, which succeeded convict labor. The taco workers were born from unemployed and homeless people roaming big cities like Tokyo and Osaka. These people in hard situations would be spotted by agents who would recruit them with promises of employment. The agents would proceed to introduce them to brokers who gave them money in advance for food and alcohol. This was, of course, bait. The recruited would eventually find themselves indebted to their brokers and they need to repay the money that was given to them up front. Unable to pay, they would then be sent to Hokkaido to work in the mines or on construction sites. People nicknamed them taco, meaning octopus. The taco were kept in camps called taco camps, taco bay, and they weren't allowed to leave the premises of said camps. Prisons in Alban name. Inside these places, there were hierarchies, and the one on top was the foreman, or Boogashira, who would supervise the other workers and enforce discipline. The conditions in the coal mines were awful, reminiscent of the ones in Oronai. Despite the advance in technology, gas explosions were still commonplace. In the Yubari mine alone, 90 men were killed by an explosion in 1908, 269 and 216 were killed in explosions in 1912, and 400 perished in 1914 after the burst of a gas line. The writer Kobayashi Takeshi talks about the taco in the novel he wrote in 1929, The Crab Cannery Ship. When workers on the mainland grew arrogant and could no longer be forced to overwork, and when markets reached an impasse and refused to expand any further, then capitalists stretched out their claws to Hokkaido, to Karafuto. There they could mistreat people to their heart's content, ride them brutally as they did in their colonies of Korea and Taiwan. The capitalists understood that there would be no one to complain. The name for workers in Hokkaido was octopus. In order to stay alive, an octopus will even devour its own limbs. It was just like that. Here, a primitive exploitation could be practiced against anyone, without any scruples. It yielded loads of profit. What's more, such doings were cleverly identified with developing the national wealth, and deftly rationalized away. It was very shrewdly done. Workers were starved and beaten to death for the sake of the nation. Taco labor was only abolished after the end of the Pacific War. Now, because there was such a huge demand for coal, even taco labor wasn't enough. Japan couldn't answer to all the requests. By 1916, 2,382 women were working as coal miners in Hokkaido. It is possible that children were involved as well. Kobayashi mentions children pushing loaded mine cars between stations. It was in 1916 that Korean laborers were sent to the Yubari mine for the first time. By 1917, that number had risen from 33 to 192, then to 447 the next year. 10 years later, 1928, there were 6,416 Koreans living in Hokkaido, and all of them worked in coal mines. Their wages and working conditions were even worse than the ones Japanese miners were subjected to. Because they were forced to take the most dangerous jobs, they were more vulnerable to injuries and fatal accidents. Interestingly, by the 1920s, the working conditions of the convicts in Hokkaido had improved so much, thanks to the abolishment of outdoor prison work, that both the Koreans and the taco workers were deeply envious of them. Compared to them, criminals had it good. They were now the ones working in the mining industry and on road construction. A hierarchy had formed, with the criminals on top, followed by the taco workers, and with the Korean laborers at the very bottom. Kobayashi describes the scenario as such. Everyone envied the prisoners who worked in a nearby jail. Koreans were treated most cruelly of all, not only by the bosses and overseers, but by their fellow Japanese laborers. And because they were at the bottom and had virtually nothing to lose, the Korean would revolt and often take action against their exploitation. On 24 March 1918, for example, a group of 82 Korean workers that had arrived to Yubari from Busan presented complaints when they realized the conditions waiting for them at the mines weren't the same they had been promised back in Korea, complaints that were promptly ignored. The following day, they broke through the police station window with their hands wrapped in cloths to show their insatisfaction. In 1919, a group of miners formed a union in Yubari, and the following year, the first Korean labor organization in Japan was established. Nevertheless, the use of Korean forced labor continued throughout the war. It is estimated that 145,000 Korean workers were brought to Hokkaido to work on coal mines and construction sites. And even though Koreans were the most affected, 16,000 Chinese workers suffered the same fate. And yeah, I think this pretty much sums it all up. I mentioned the Ainu, the prisoners, the Tako, and the Korean and Chinese workers. Our last stop is the Abashiri Prison Museum. We didn't end up in the real Abashiri prison this time. We learned from our mistake of the day before. Because we arrived at lunchtime, we had the opportunity of eating at a restaurant that is at the entrance of the facility, which serves 2 special meals emulating the real meals that are given to prison inmates at the current Abashiri prison. The meals consist of a mixture of rice and wheat, 70% rice, 30% wheat, grilled fish, mackerel pike or atka mackerel, a small dish, a mid-sized dish, and miso soup. My dad decided to go for the atka mackerel. I don't like fish, so I got an Abashiri prison wagyu beef instead, with the ginger ale. It was really good, especially with the soft egg on top. I was sort of starving by then, so I was really happy that I could eat something. A lot of the buildings that you can see in this museum date from 1912, because most of the Abashiri prison burned down in a fire in 1909. The museum wouldn't exist at all if it wasn't for a man called Sato Isashi, who was the owner of the Abashiri newspaper. When he heard that the government wanted to renovate the prison and move it to a modern, reinforced concrete complex, he argued that the old prison buildings should be preserved, for their historical value. The citizens of Abashiri also joined the cause, for they believed it was important to educate the future generations about the role of the prison in Abashiri's history. Together, they established the Abashiri Prison Preservation Foundation. Their efforts to save the old prison proved successful. The original structures were moved to the vicinities of Mount Tento on the other side of the Abashiri River and turned into the museum that we can visit today. The Abashiri Prison Museum opened to the public in 1983. The early days of the museum were quite rocky, since there was a loan of over 900 million yen that needed to be repaid, the costs of dismantling, relocating, and restoring all of those buildings. But everything worked out in the end. There are 25 historical buildings in exhibition at the museum. 6 of them are considered tangible cultural property, and 8 of them are registered as important cultural property. I'll briefly talk about some of the most important ones. The most famous of all is the radial 5-wing prison house, the only surviving radial-style prison structure in Japan. At the center of the building, there is an octagonal guardhouse which allows those inside to look in all the different directions. The 226 cells, consisting of communal cells and solitary confinement, could house up to 700 prisoners. The doors were made of ash tree and had openings to allow the guards to look inside and to pass food. Said doors could only be opened from the outside. The whole structure has high skylights and vertical bars that prevent who is inside a cell from seeing or being seen by who is inside the facing cell. The lecture hall is another preeminent building, with a Japanese-style exterior and a Western-style interior. Its purpose was to provide mental and moral instruction and religious salvation to the prison inmates. The majority of the buildings are dark and sober, but there is one that catches the eye for being light, blue and grey, with a dignified look. It houses the offices of the staff, including the wardens, as well as the meeting room. Nowadays it greets the visitors, and inside you can find a coffee shop and a souvenir shop. The shop sells goods produced by the inmates of the current Abashiri prison, and of course, Golden Kamuy merchandise. The Abashiri prison is one of the most important elements of the Golden Kamuy story, being the place where Noperabu, the man with the gold, is kept imprisoned. The criminals who status into the location of the gold are all Abashiri prison escapees. At one point, the protagonists even attempt to break into the prison in order to contact Noperabu. So it is one of the most important places for someone doing the Golden Kamuy pilgrimage. At this point in the journey, I had already a considerable amount of merchandise, so all I got was a box full of anpan, GK themed. The anpan is a Japanese traditional sweet, a bread pan filled with paste. The box had 6 anpan, each representing a character, each with a different filling. Pumpkin for Sugimoto, the classic red bean paste for Azirpa, matcha paste for Tsukishima, black sesame paste for Ogata, bean paste with lots of brown sugar for Shiraishi, and again, bean paste for Koito, but apparently a recreation of a traditional regional anpan. The anpan were very useful for midnight snacking while I was in Japan, since I have a tendency to wake up at ungodly hours of the night starving. The one I liked the most was Ogata's, which sounds suspicious given is one of my favorites, but I promise I was impartial, okay? It just is one was of the less sweet, along with Shukishima's, but it didn't have that bitterness of the matcha. And as I mentioned in my last video, I like my food on the milder side, not too sweet, not too bitter, and not too salty. Anyway, moving on, the Futamigaoka buildings are also some of the most important. They are located on a hilly land of western Abashiri and are the oldest remaining prison buildings made out of wood in Japan. Prisoners with light sentences were sent to this section of the prison, where they weren't confined inside 4 walls, to work on farming duty, planting and harvesting their own food. Here security was lower compared to other parts of the prison. A bit older than the ones mentioned so far, built in 1919 instead of 1912, it's the Black Gate. Made out of bricks, the prisoners made themselves on a brick factory that existed inside the prison. The Black Gate is part of a long wall, 1,800 meters long, that took the prisoners 5 years to build. This is the brickwork punishment chamber, where rules breakers were confined. The chamber has a double door, no windows, and 42 cm thick brick walls. The one inside was confined in an extremely uncomfortable position and was fed reduced rations. Finally, this is a guard at station. There were 4 of these. They were used as lookout stations so no one could leave the prison or approach the prison from the outside without being noticed. There were also many other buildings to see, including a restored courthouse, a miso and soy sauce storehouse, a vegetable storehouse, the temporary quarters or mobile cells used during the construction of the central road, and more. At one point we were running around trying to see everything because the complex was just this big. You probably noticed this already, but the prison is full of life-size wax figures that represent the inmates that were once held in Abashiri. These statues are wearing the prison uniforms, the characteristic orange ones. There are also wax figures representing the guards, and some even move. The museum also has an interactive section, with an area where you can walk with an iron ball attached to your foot, tie the braided hat and the uniform the prisoners used to wear, and feel the weight of a moko, a basket made of straw where prisoners would carry earth, sand, pebbles, and heavy rocks when they were constructing the road. In the 4D movie theater, a 7-minute video about the construction of the Central Road plays in several different languages, including English. The movie is called Forest Where Inmates in a Red Prison Uniform Worked, Akai Shuto no Mori. It starts with a photo of Kaneko Kentaro, the man who wrote the letter that sealed the prisoner's fate. Then the scenario changes to that of a forest in Hokkaido, where convicts are working under a storm. You can see them collapsing from exhaustion and malnutrition. The movie ends with footage of the present-day Central Road and images of the monuments that were erected in homage to those who died thanks to the ordeal. There is also a small area where you can see how prisoners are treated in the current Abashiri prison. Once kept in wooden buildings, they now reside in clean ferro-concrete structures. It is said that in the past, The Abashiri prison was so cold tears would freeze, but today there are heating and cooling systems in place. Besides single cells, there are also multi-prisoner cells, but they only hold up to 6 prisoners. I want to finish this video by talking about the man who inspired the creation of Shiraishi. In Golden Kamuy, Shiraishi is one of the tattooed prisoners who escaped Abashiri. He is known as the Escape King, because no prison can hold him. He is able to escape no matter how sticky the situation. He hides useful objects inside of his body and is able to dislocate every joint. Like a cat, he can turn his body into a sort of liquid and squeeze through every crack. Turns out that there was indeed a real man who was known as the Escape King, or the man no prison could hold. His name was Yoshi Shiratori. Shiratori became famous for having escaped 4 high-security prisons. In 1983, the author Akira Yoshimura published Agoku, Prison Break, a novel based on his life. Sadly, I don't think there is a translation of the book to English or Portuguese. The book was later adapted into a film. Shiratori's determination to escape the tortuous conditions of Japanese prisons turned him into an anti-hero, or a sort of folk hero, and his stories brought attention to the subject of human rights, or lack of, in the context of prisons. While the fact that Shiratori escaped 4 times is true, a lot of the details present in the tales are folkloric rather than based in reality, as it tends to happen with stories of this kind. Fantasy and reality intertwine, making it so we can tell where one ends and the other begins. In any case, this is how the legend goes. Yoshi Shiratori was born in the Aomori prefecture on July 31, 1907. He had an older brother and a younger sister. His father died when he was very young, and his mother left him and his sister, bringing with her only the oldest son. The 2 children were left with their aunt, who ran a tofu store, and spent their teenage years helping her out. When he became 18, Shiratori found a job on a Russian ship, catching crabs. Eventually, he married and had a child. It is said he had quite a unique body, being able to dislocate his joints to squeeze through tight places. Supposedly, he was able to go through any hole as long as there was enough space for the head. I'm not sure if this is scientifically possible. Humans are not cats after all, but it is clear this Shiratori guy has some kind of hypermobility. A lot less trustworthy are the tales about his strength. Legends say he was able to run 120 kilometers in one day, that he could pull out of the ground a buried chimney with his own hands, and that in old age he was still able to hold a rice bag horizontally over his head. Shiratori's life turned south when he became addicted to gambling. He started spending all of his money on it, and upon losing it all, he turned to stealing. On April 3, 1933, he was part of a group of thieves that robbed a storehouse in Agashitsugaru. Here, there are 2 versions of the story. On one of them, the adopted son of the owner chases the thieves and ends up stabbed to death on a confrontation, and on the other version, a client named Takezu is the one that tries to defend the shop, chasing the criminals and meeting his demise. In any case, an innocent man gets killed during the robbery. 2 years later, one of the thieves got arrested and spilled the beans about Shiratori being involved in the crime. Having been denounced, Shiratori probably thought the best course of action was to turn himself in, and so he did. Although he denied having anything to do with the murder itself, he was allegedly subjected to torture during the interrogation. Having pulled the confession out of him this way, the police proceeded to send Shiratori to the Aomori prison, where he was arrested for murder. One source says that Shiratori valiantly took the beating and refused to speak, but that it was all for nothing, for he still got charged with the murder. As for if Shiratori did stab that man on the robbery of 1933, only he knows. Or only he knew, because he is dead now. In the Aomori prison, Shiratori was allegedly treated horribly, and after complaining, treated even worse. At some point, he stayed for months in a solitary, and the guards would appear frequently to hurt him. As the abuse continued, he started studying the movements of the guards and noticed that at some point in the morning there was a 15-minute gap in the patrol time, a short moment when no one was watching him. In the Aomori prison, the bucket that prisoners would use to wash themselves had the metal wire wrapped around it, and Shiratori used it to pick his cell lock. In June of 1936, he made his escape, passing through a cracked skylight. To fool the guards, he placed floorboards inside his futon to make it seem a person was sleeping inside. As for the door at the end of the corridor, the guards had carelessly left it open. Convenient, but not impossible. To be true, this is probably the reason why Shiratori chose that day to escape, although a more romanticized version says he chose that moment to punish a certain guard that had been particularly cruel to him. By escaping after that guard's shift, he was bound to get him into trouble. Shiratori lived in the mountains for 3 days, feeding on wild berries, but when he took a riskier step and attempted to steal supplies from a hospital, he was caught and sent to Miyagi Prison. This time, he got a life sentence. He spent some months in Miyagi, then on April 1937, he was transferred to the Kozugi Prison in Tokyo. Here, Shiratori was happy with the way he was treated. He even made friends with the head guard Iyomiya Kobayashi. But because all good things come to an end, once Japan entered the Second World War, Shiratori was transferred again, this time to Akita. In Akita, he was treated even worse than in the first prison he had been incarcerated. Because of that one time he had run away, he was considered a prisoner of high risk, so he wasn't kept at all times and had been put in a special cell made for prisoners with a history of escape, with high ceilings, a small skylight, and copper walls. Every time he had a chance, Shiratori would break out of his handcuffs. None of the sources explain how. Either he would pick the lock with something or he would dislocate his wrists, climb the walls using his arms and legs, and pry away at the wooden framing of the skylight that was starting to rot. He waited for a stormy night to make his escape through the skylight to the roof, so his footsteps wouldn't be heard, muffled by the sound of the rain and wind. This time, Shiratori was on the run for 3 months. He decided to travel to Tokyo to visit the house of Kobayashi, the one officer who had been nice to him, to ask for his help. He wanted to denounce the injustice of the Japanese prison system, the abuse that happened inside those walls. Here, again, there are 2 versions of the story. Kobayashi either turns against his friend, for his duty comes first and calls the police, or he convinces Shiratori to turn himself in. In both cases, Shiratori ends up confined again, and this time there is no more playing around. Shiratori gets sent to Abashiri, the prison no inmate had ever escaped from. This wasn't at all what Shiratori wanted, since he had asked to be put in the Kozugi prison. 3 extra years were also added to his life sentence, something that certainly kept him up at night. Shiratori arrived in Abashiri in the winter of 1943, and the clothes that were given to him were extremely thin. It is said that in a fit of rage, while trembling from the cold, he broke his handcuffs in front of the guards and swore to escape, although this episode of the story is very clearly fictional. One day, the guards found Shiratori without his handcuffs, and when they searched his cell, they found a piece of metal wrapped in paraffin. After this, they put him in special hand and leg cuffs. A lot of things are said about his cuffs. Rumors say they had a weight of over 15 kilograms, and that a specialist had to come every week to take them off Shiratori so he could bet. As the months passed by, Shiratori's wrists and ankles became bruised due to the nasty cuffs. A source even mentions larvae infestations. Shiratori had to get out. So he brewed a plan. Every time he was served a meal, Shiratori would spill miso soup on his cuffs and on the frames of the narrow foot slot on his cell door. The salt that the miso soup contained started to oxidize the screws, little by little, leading to corrosion. This begs the question, how come that a specialist that visited Shiratori once a week didn't notice the corrosion? I can only speculate, and 3 possibilities came to mind. First, gross negligence. Like, come on man, you had one job. Second, the specialist never existed at all, and the job was done by regular guards who, because they did it to all the prisoners routinely, didn't pay that much attention. Third, Shiratori was never uncuffed, not even during bedtime. Fact is, Shiratori managed to get out of those special cuffs of his, and he saw his chance to escape during a wartime blackout on August 26, 1944. To squeeze through the tiny foot slot, he dislocated both of his shoulders. This escape was the one that made him famous, because, after all, no one had ever escaped Abashiri prison. Shiratori headed to the snowy mountains and took refuge in an abandoned mine. He lived out of nuts, berries, and wild animals for 2 years. Civilization was probably too tempting thought, because he eventually found himself in a village again, where he found out that the war had ended and Japan had surrendered. He then tried to steal some tomatoes from a farm, but things went horribly wrong. The farmers saw him and Shiratori was unable to avoid a confrontation. He ended up killing the farmer. When he was captured by the police, he claimed self-defense, but he wasn't believed, given his history and his fame. Stories of his escapes had been featured in several front pages by then. This time, he got a death sentence. Since they needed to lock him somewhere before the execution, the prison chosen was the Sapporo prison. Here, he was thrown into a cell with very high walls, and with windows smaller than his head. 6 guards were outside the cell surveilling him. The guards were confident he couldn't escape this time, so they didn't even feel the need to handcuff him. But Shiratori wasn't a one-trick pony. Realizing it was indeed impossible to escape through the ceiling, he turned his attention to the floor. To mislead the guards, he would often spend long periods of time looking up. But then, when they weren't looking, he would put his plan into action. He unscrewed one of the cell's floorboards, used the screw to get a metal wire from the cell's sanitary vase, used said metal wire to saw the floorboards, and then dug a tunnel using miso soup balls. He only worked on the tunnel during nighttime, when it was dark, and positioned the hole right under his bed. As for the leftover dirt, he would hide it inside a small pocket found under the floorboards. Shiratori was free again, and this time he was out for almost an entire year. One day, while in a park, he was offered a cigarette by a police officer, who didn't recognize him. Moved by the gesture, as cigarettes were a luxury item in post-war Japan, Shiratori confessed he was an escaped convict and was rearrested and brought before the Sapporo High Court. As you might recall, he had been given the death sentence, but a bout of luck struck at that moment. Japan's prison system was going through the post-war reforms, and upon hearing Shiratori's version of the story, this is that he had escaped due to the abusive conditions of the prisons he had been in, the court was sympathetic and revoked his death sentence, ruling the killing of the farmer as self-defense. It helped that he hadn't killed or harmed a single guard during his escapes. Shiratori was sentenced to 20 years, and his request to be imprisoned in Tokyo's Fushu prison was granted. There, he was given the position of gardener and participated in several activities. Now that he had no desire to escape, he was a well-behaved convict, and ended up being released after just 14 years. It is said that one day, knowing his fame, the director of the prison called Shiratori to question him about the subject, and that Shiratori answered he wasn't going to run away anymore, for he was tired. Shiratori was released on December 21, 1961. He reunited with his daughter and did a variety of odd jobs. His final days were spent in Aomori, where he died of a heart attack in 1979, at the age of 71. A woman he had befriended, who lived in the neighborhood, buried his ashes in a cemetery with a view over Mount Fuji. This is the full story of Shiratori Yoshi, the man no prison could hold. But did you know there was another, less known, escape king? His name was Nishikawa Gozunkugi Torakashi, or Torakashi Longnail. Western sources do not talk about this man, and the only reason why I know about his existence is thanks to a short movie that played in the Abashiri prison. And because I had to take a trip to the Japanese side of the internet and rely on translation, I do ask you to, as always, be mindful of any inaccuracies that might exist. Torakashi was born in 1854, either the second or fourth son of a farmer in the Kamimito village, Mie Prefecture. I found 2 very different records of his life. So different they could very well refer to two distinct people. As I don't know which one is the closest to reality, I will tell you both. The first version I found in a blog, the second on a comment section by an old Japanese man from the Kabato region. On the first version of the story, Torakashi is less of a bastard, as you will see. This is how it goes. When Torakishi was only 14 years old, his uncle, with whom he had a wonderful relationship with, was killed in a gambling dispute. To avenge his uncle, Torakishi took a blade and wielded it against the person who had killed him, after which he set fire to that person's house. For this crime, he got a life sentence and was sent to a local prison. Since he was still a young boy and the crime he had committed was to avenge a loved one, the other inmates took care of him in the prison. They even helped the lad escape when news broke out that the person Torakishi had tried to kill had actually survived his wounds and was still around. Torakishi didn't get too far before getting captured again, thought. Once more he escaped, helped by the other prisoners. This is when the story turns weird, because there is no more reference to the person Torakishi wanted to kill. He was so determined to avenge his uncle, but the tale never discloses if he actually succeeded or not. Next time we hear of Torakishi, he is wandering, traveling all over the country. He is now a consummate gambler. Eventually, he is caught by the police, and this time he is sent to a prison in Akita. This prison isn't able to hold him for long, thought, and one day he is gone and about again. Torakishi decides he wants to return to his hometown, Temie Prefecture, but gets into a gambling dispute on the way, in Shizuoka Prefecture. The conflict brings the attention of the police, and upon seeing them, Torakishi takes off. And from this chase, a legend is born. While running, Torakishi steps on a gozun kugi, a long nail that was stuck in a board. Despite the pain, Torakishi keeps running, with the nail on his foot, and keeps going for 10 kilometers before getting caught. After this, he gained the nickname Kosunguki no Torakishi, Torakishi Long Nail. Torakishi was kept for a while in the Tokyo detention house and then sent to the Tsukigata Prison. But because he kept running away, he escaped a total of 3 times, the justice system finally decided to send him to the Kushiro Prison in Shibesha. He was part of those who later were transferred to what would become the Abashiri Prison. Sometime after he left Kabato, he started to mellow. He didn't try to escape no more, due to a combination of factors, including his advanced age and a good relationship with the guard. He became an exemplary prisoner, and was even allowed entire freedom of movement on the premises of the prison. Torakishi was released from Abashiri on September 3, 1924, due to his old age of 71. He traveled the country as a showman, and in performances he would talk about his stormy life. That is how he became famous. At the beginning of the Showa period, he returned to his hometown in Mie, and his son took care of him. He died peacefully in 1941. In the second version of the story, Torakishi didn't start his life as a delinquent when he was 14. He lived normally up until the age of 21, having married at 19 and becoming a father shortly after. Up until the day he wounded his older brother during a nasty discussion. The assault must have been quite severe, because he was thrown in jail for 2 years. His life didn't get any better after he was released. Due to the influence of bad friends and his older brother, he started participating in robberies which often involved violence. He served time both in the prison of Yokohama and in Mie. He escaped for the first time from Yokohama prison. During transportation, the guards lost sight of him, and he took that opportunity. He was imprisoned in Mie after arming the family's landlord due to a grudge. He and his group of friends also committed arson. He escaped the prison in Mie, and what happens next is the famous nail incident. While being chased by the cops, he stepped on a 20-centimeter nail. He kept running, even with the nail buried deep in his foot. He ran until he got caught. Torakishi spent some time in the Tokyo detention house before being sent to Sorachi. He escaped once again. Torakishi went missing up until the fall of 1889. He got seen breaking into a liquor store in Kanagawa with a weapon. He tried to keep a low profile and hide with his lovers somewhere, but the police found him 10 days later. This time he was sent to Kabato, to the Tsukigata Prison. At this point they didn't know who he was. He pretended to be a regular guy called Yatsutaru Nishikawa. This made-up guy had no criminal history, so he was put in a cell full of first-time criminals. He gained the admiration of the other criminals for being great at Anafuda, a Japanese card game. Torakishi was having a good time up until a guard who had been in Sorachi recognized him. Torakishi Longnails, the criminal who was sleazy like an eel. He was immediately thrown into a solitary, and an iron ball was attached to his ankles. Maybe he wouldn't have escaped if they had kept him there. But at that point, outdoor labor still hadn't been abolished. Torakishi and the other prisoners were sent to repair a water supply dam, and he took this opportunity to attack the guards. The other inmates participated in the attack as well, and they all ran to Atsuta to blend with the fishermen. Atsuta was experiencing a herring boom, so it was pretty crowded, with people coming from everywhere to participate in the fishing and gain some cash. It was a smart plan, but Torakishi was still caught just 5 days after the jailbreak. He was put in a solitary and subjected to an even more severe surveillance. The iron ball attached to his ankles was heavier now, with a weight of 3.75 kilograms. His sentence was changed to life imprisonment. And still, Torakishi would still participate in outside labor. So one night, after returning from work, he took a gamble. When the guard was crouched attaching the iron to his feet, Torakishi kicked him with all his might. He locked the unconscious guard in his cell and ran through the corridor until he was outside. He was now out of the building, but still inside the prison complex. He then took off his orange uniform and dropped it into a puddle. Using the drenched clothes to create suction, he climbed a foldable screen over 5 meters height. Arriving at the Shikari River pier, Torakishi crossed the river through a cable that was usually used to carry baskets to the opposite shore, like a monkey moving through trees. Escaping Tsukigata prison for the second time was quite the feat, but seems like Torakishi was better at escaping prisons than he was at evading capture. He eventually committed another violent robbery and was caught once again. The stunning escape from Kabato was also Torakishi's last jailbreak, for his age was starting to catch up to him. He was now close to 40 years old and his strength and energy were starting to decline. He humbly served his sentence for 9 years, then sent to Abashiri to serve some more. Torakishi's life sentence was overturned, and he ended up being released in 1924. The news spread thanks to several newspapers, so he ended up being contacted by a businessman called Satoi Toni. Together, they created the Kosun Kugi Torakishi Theater Company, which traveled the country with Torakishi as the main lead. At the beginning of the show period, he returned to his hometown in Mie to reunite with his son. He died peacefully at the age of 88. So, even though Shiratori escaped from 4 different prisons and was the only one to ever escape Abashiri, Torakishi Longnail is the one that holds the record for the number of jailbreaks, so both are escape kings in their own right. And it's with the stories of these two men that I will conclude today's video. It took me several weeks, but I managed to cover everything related to the prisons of Hokkaido. Next time, follow me into the lakes and the woods, and let's learn everything there is to know about the Ainu. I hope to see you there. Bye!